I think we're live. All right. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with us today. So Beth is a functional medicine naturopath and a genetic analyst. She specializes in mast cell activation, histamine issues, and also mold. So I feel like she's got some really good information for us today. Beth, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me, Sarah. And for my 16th birthday, all I wanted was a copy of Grey's Anatomy. So that tells you how big of a deal this was for me. But when I was a kid, we had moved into an old farmhouse, and it seemed like a big adventure, but my health kept going downhill. And one of the things that I can really relate with your group with is having those chronic hives. So growing up in the country, one of my jobs was to pick green beans, which if you grow up in the country, you eat a lot of green beans. And we would can those. And anytime I had to get out in the garden and pick things, I would be just covered head to toe with these welts and itching. And I would, even outside of the hives, I was so itchy all the time. I would scratch my skin in my sleep until I bled. And I'm sure a lot of people have that experience. And nobody knew what I was dealing with other than they just called it allergies. One of my other jobs was to feed the chickens. And whenever I had to feed them dried corn, I'd also break out in hives from head to toe. So it was just miserable. But my health issues accelerated as I went along. And by the time I got to college, I had such severe chronic fatigue, muscle pain, joint pain, fibromyalgia, that I had earned multiple scholarships to medical school, which are hard to get. And I had to turn them all down. And it was just devastating. And instead of becoming the neurologist I wanted to be, I became the chronically ill patient and went from traditional doctor to traditional doctor, exhausted everything they could offer me. I was on so many medications and I just kept getting worse. And then I was taking medications for the side effects of the medications, which was getting ridiculous. And when I did the gamut of everything that traditional medicine knew to do, and the best practitioner said, I'm sorry, I've never seen anybody like you. I don't know what to do about this. And the worst told me I was crazy, or told me that, well, my labs look normal, so you can't really be sick. They thought I was attention seeking. And that was really devastating because I was working so hard to get well. And I was cleaning up my diet and looking into all kinds of things. And then I started with holistic medicine, did everything that I could find there. I tried homeopathy just in case I was crazy. I did 10 years of therapy. That didn't change my symptoms. Helped me get stronger emotionally and healthier emotionally. And that was a good part of my journey, but it didn't solve my health symptoms. And then functional medicine started coming on the scene. So I'm in my 40s now. And I always say that because people think I'm like 25 or something. But, I started with functional medicine and we exhausted what functional medicine had. And I thought, oh my gosh. I mean, I was working with the best, most experienced practitioner in my area. It was before we had telehealth, so I didn't have access to people outside of my area. But I remember the day that he said, we've tried everything we know how to do and you're not responding. It's not getting any better. And I cried the whole drive home. I could barely drive at that point. I was so sick. And I went home with nothing. I was grateful he was honest with me, but I thought, what else am I going to do? What am I going to turn to? I was still itching head to toe. I used to keep a flashlight by my bed. And I think some other people can probably relate to this because I was terrified I had bed bugs. Like I itched so badly, and I would jump up in the middle of the night and check my mattress and check my sheets, and nobody could figure out what was going on. I started taking Benadryl and other antihistamines, and it would maybe take a little edge off. But I tell you, there were a few things that really turned it around for me. One was learning about histamine intolerance and starting to bring the histamine foods, lower that. And then that made a difference in the itching and the hives. And I had been doing everything like heal the gut, and I was doing all these ferments, and eating things like I was making my own kefir, and I was making my own kombucha and my own sauerkraut, and all those things. I ate lots of strawberries because of the antioxidants, and I didn't know about the histamine side of things. Then I learned about mast cell activation because I only got so far with working on the histamine side of things. I maybe got about a 20% improvement in my symptoms, which was helpful. But there was clearly something bigger going on because I couldn't control it just with diet and some of the supplements that help with histamine. So figuring out the mast cell activation was a big game changer. And when I learned about that, and I was following Yasmina Kellenstam, who started, she was called Low Histamine Chef when she started, and then Healing Histamine. And she was a big part of my journey, and learned a lot through her. And she started reporting on mast cell activation syndrome. And that all the light bulbs went off. And I went, oh my gosh, it's not just these isolated things. They're all connected by these mast cells. And then I had to figure out, well, why are these mast cells getting dysregulated? And finally, and I knew I'd had Lyme, but I couldn't tolerate any treatments. And so I was so stuck. But we figured out I had mold toxicity. That unraveled this whole picture. And so many people are dealing with mold toxicity and dealing with mast cell activation and have no idea. And mast cell activation, we know now from the population studies, is affecting the low end 9% of the Western population, maybe up to 17%. Some estimates now are saying higher than that. So if we think about how many, that's at least 1 in 10 people. That might be 1 in 9. We could be as high as 1 in 8. That's a lot of people dealing with this. It's one of the most under-recognized and underappreciated conditions affecting people with things like chronic itching. And I bet most of the people dealing with the chronic hives, chronic itching, have other symptoms as well.
Yeah, that's one thing that I'll look at the symptoms of mast cell activation, and I look at the symptoms that we experience, and I'm like, these are basically the same thing, and they'll say, chronic spontaneous urticaria is basically just the degranulation of the mast cells. And then you look at the mast cell activation syndrome, it's kind of like the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like all these things are clicking, because I'm like, we just kind of collect these diagnoses and we see different specialists for different areas. And it's really interesting when you look deeper and you see that they're all related. And I was watching one of your Facebook Lives about the mold probably a couple months ago, and I was just like, wow, like check. I've got all these symptoms. And it's this, I took the test and I tested positive for almost every type. And I was like blown away, because I've been working for years on this, as a lot of us have, trying different diets, different supplements, this and that. And then, the long-term antihistamines, and kind of wondering, how is that going to affect me in the long run? So that's always been a goal of mine, just to get off of those. So everything clicked, and I'm so excited that you came to talk to us today, because I feel like this will benefit a lot of people.
It's been a game changer. It was a game changer in my own life. And then I got well enough. People were actually coming out of the woodwork because when I saw you a year ago, you were hobbling with a cane and you looked like you weren't going to make it through the day. And that just the amount of change every year that happened. And so people joke that I'm Benjamin Button because I look younger as I'm going, because they're getting all this inflammation down. But it's a huge game changer to figure out the why. And I got well to the point that I went back to graduate school and I got my master's degree, and then I got a doctorate in traditional naturopathy and started consulting with people, because people were just asking me, what did you do? Can you walk me through it? And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it well, and I want to do it right, and I want to get the background and the training to help, because not everybody's just like me. But with the people that I've worked with, and I've worked with over 600 people at this point with complex issues of mast cell activation, and I do consulting and work with people who have gone from practitioner, people aren't able to figure out their case. And then my job is to look at, well, what stones haven't been turned over, what hasn't been looked through, what hasn't been explored. And the mold toxicity has become epidemic. Most of the people I see have worked with over 10 practitioners. They usually have multiple specialists like you're talking about. And we need those specialists. We absolutely need those specialists for different kinds of situations that can arise where you need that kind of in-depth look, but you also have to have somebody on the case who's going to pull back and say, well, wait a minute, how is this all connected? How are these gut symptoms connected with the itching, with the hives, with the brain fog, trouble sleeping? Because they're not disconnected. Our whole body, it's kind of like trying to say, oh, well, my little finger has nothing to do with my thumb. But they're all part of your hand.
Right. So how does someone know if they have histamine intolerance versus actual mast cell activation versus just chronic hives?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe we should pull back even and talk about what are mast cells and what is histamine. So mast cells, and it's M-A-S-T as in Tom, mast cells, they are immune cells, and they're very important immune cells in our body. They're in almost every single tissue. There's very few tissue that the mast cells are not in. So they're not in the retina, but we have mast cells in the skin, very high numbers in the skin. Mast cells are in anywhere where your body meets the outside world. That's how you can think about it. The lining of the eyes, the sinuses, the nose, the entire GI tract from the mouth all the way down to the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines. They're in the lungs, they're in the trachea, they're in all the lining of the blood vessels. They're in our spleen. I mean, they're made in the bone marrow. You have some in muscles. They're at every nerve ending. So what that tells us is they're very instrumental to our survival. And these mast cells are quite complex. They're some of the most complex cells in the body. They were first described in 1878. And every year there's still new things being discovered about these cells. That's how complex they are. These cells have hundreds of what are called receptors on the outside. And those receptors are sensing what's outside of them. So I think of them like the first sensing, defending, kind of like our first responder cells in our bodies. Then they have in them hundreds of different chemicals called mediators. And there are estimates that there's over 1,000 different ones. So that makes them very well suited to respond to a whole variety of things. So they're going to respond to every molecule of air you breathe, every molecule of food you eat. They're also, remember, they're in the brain and the nervous system. They're responding to stress. They're responding to injury. They have roles in pregnancy. They regulate sleep-wake cycles. They have so many critical roles in their body. One of the primary roles is protecting us from toxins and pathogens, and then initiating the healing response when we're injured. So if you think about, most people can relate to, if you've cut yourself, you don't get it cleaned out quickly enough. Let's say you're working outside and it's really dirty, and then that cut gets red and swollen. That's the mast cells initiating a response and calling the other immune cells in. So they're a big immune cell or immune system communicator as well. One of the mediators, and the most well-known, is histamine in the mast cells. There's two other cells that make histamine as well. One's called basophils and one's called eosinophils. The mast cells are the bigger player here for most people. Then they also, another type of mediators become a household word now, are cytokines. They make cytokines, and cytokines are just messaging molecules. So we talk about a cytokine storm. The mast cells are part of that response, that over response. But in normal people, mast cells should be responding to what's happening. So you eat something you probably shouldn't have eaten. It's a little old. They might make you throw up, so you get that out of your body, and then things should calm back down. Or if you get something on your skin that shouldn't be on your skin, that's not good for you, they're going to start responding and helping clean that up and get it off your skin. If you get a splinter embedded, they're going to produce the inflammation to push that splinter out. What's happened though is because the mast cells are there to respond to anything going on in our environment, if we think about how we were, I don't know, let's go with 500 years ago, we lived in a completely different culture than we live in now, absolutely unrecognizable. So you would get your work done, you would have periods of rest. We didn't have chemicals, we didn't have factories, we didn't have any of these things. We did have mold, and that's important to know. We did have mold, but we didn't have electromagnetic fields, we didn't have Wi-Fi, we didn't have any of this stuff. And there were genetic mast cell disorders, but this mast cell activation syndrome was not a big deal. What's happened is we are exposed to so many things now on a daily basis that trigger mast cells. So you think about just the level of stress that we have, financial, political, familial stress. If you think about all the divisions this past 2 years and all the stuff that's going on for us, just on that stressor side, that the amount of toxins just in our food and our water supply, the plastics, the fragrances and candles that are hormone disruptors and those plugins, all of these things our mast cells have to constantly respond to. So what's happened is I think of them like the guards of your castle gate to keep you protected and safe. And they should be able to know the difference between, oh, here's the baker bringing bread in and that's safe, so we're going to let them in. Oh, that's an enemy, we're going to keep them out, we're going to launch an attack. If you were a guard at a castle gate and you had to be on guard 24/7 and you never got a break and there's constantly things coming at you, you know, from ever having sleep deprivation, you get wonky. Mast cells get wonky and they start over responding and they get oversensitive. So they're going to respond to things they wouldn't normally respond to. Not everybody, when they feed corn to chickens, breaks out in hives. But I had already had so much toxin load, both in utero, just generational, the food, we didn't have a clean diet growing up. We ate lots of processed food where I was growing up. And then I was living in this house full of toxic mold. So my mast cells were already getting dysregulated. What you're looking for in terms of whether you have this or not is, do you have symptoms in 2 or more systems? First of all, that's one of the criteria. So if somebody's only symptom is itching and hives, and they only have skin symptoms, and truly nothing else, there's no GI issue, perfect GI tract, there's no brain fog, there's no sleep issues, there's no breathing issues, nothing, then that would not be a mast cell activation issue. You might have issues only with the mast cells in skin, but it wouldn't be called mast cell activation syndrome. So that would be your classic, simply chronic urticaria. But chronic urticaria is a symptom of mast cell activation syndrome. And what makes it so hard is that people can show up in all kinds of different ways. So you could be like me, where I literally had symptoms in every system. Or I have some people who they just have brain fog, they're not sleeping well, and their guts are a mess, and maybe they have trouble with itching, or they have flushing. Ruddy cheeks are common, and flushing can happen with histamine intolerance or mast cell activation. One of the telltale signs and differences with mast cell activation, histamine intolerance, is having symptoms right after eating or while eating within about 30 minutes. And not everybody gets that has mast cell issues, but if they have that, that's generally the mast cells responding. And this is where it starts to drive people crazy trying to figure out what they're reacting to. And it may not be a particular food, it may just be the act of eating that's triggering them. You have, on the other hand, histamine intolerance is only when somebody has issue with histamine. So they may have itching, they may have GI issues. Histamine, too much histamine can cause things like acid reflux, heartburn, loose stools. You might have anxiety, you might have some sleep problems, but it's not going to be as severe and it's not going to be as complex. one of the main ways to distinguish is to lower histamine foods for about 6 weeks, see if it makes a difference, and then try to support some of the pathways. So you can take like a DAO supplement, diamine oxidase, it breaks down histamine. You can take things that help the methylation pathway that help with histamine. If you have mast cell activation, a lot of times people won't tolerate those methylation supplements, first of all. They generally have more sensitivities, not always, but they may have sensitivity supplements to foods, to stress, maybe hard to weather stress. They may have sensitivity to heat and cold or vibration. You're getting into more of a sensitivity situation there. But really the only way to tell is to first try to work on the histamine side and then see what you have left. But I did because there's so many symptoms that have been correlated with this in the research, I did take the research on the symptoms and made a symptom survey people can get on our website if they want to check it out. It's all free. And you just add up your total of symptoms. The more you have, the more likely you're dealing with mast cell activation.
Okay, great. I'm sure that'll be helpful. What's your website again so everyone can go?
mastcell360.com. So M as in Mary, AST as in Tom, CELL360.com.
Okay.
And then if you just go under MCAS, there's a symptom survey link.
Okay. So is there any kind of like testing for this that we should be asking like our immunologist for or anything like that? Or
it's a good question. So let me preface this by saying that although mast cell activation syndrome has been around for decades, the research only really picked up in the 80s and 90s, and it finally got a diagnostic code in 2016. So that tells you this criteria is quite new, and there's a lot of debate about it. And you have two camps. One camp says that mast cell activation syndrome is still more rare. And one camp says that it's very common and the diagnostic criteria is missing most cases. From my own experience and what I've seen in working with people, I'm in the latter camp. So I'll just say that. And I think this is much more common and we're missing cases. But the official diagnostic criteria is we covered the symptoms in 2 or more systems. So it'd be like skin and GI at least, or it could be skin and, somebody has phlegmy cough is common, or like that throat clearing. You can have sinus symptoms, anything like that, reproductive symptoms. And then the second one is that there has to be an elevation in one of the mast cell mediators. So that could be a urinary histamine test. That could be, there are other things they can test for, prostaglandins, leukotrienes. There's a number of them. One of the misunderstandings that's out there, and you have to realize that this isn't even taught in medical school yet. I have clients who are medical school students, and they tell me they're getting like a 1-page synopsis of mast cells, and they're not even taught any of this information. So you can't, expect, unless somebody's really specialized in this, for them to be able to even keep up with the fire hose of information that's coming out all the time. But one of the misunderstandings is that tryptase is a marker for mast cell activation syndrome. It's almost never elevated in mast cell activation syndrome, but a lot of people are being told they don't have elevated tryptase, they can't have mast cell issues. That's a distinguisher for the genetic mast cell issues, but not what we're talking about, which is where most people don't have a genetic issue with this. It's acquired. The other problem with this testing, there are a few problems. One is that we're only able to test for a handful of mediators, and there's over 1,000. So what if you don't have a problem with those mediators? You have a problem with some of the 980 other mediators. The last problem with that testing is that it's very hard for the labs to process those samples correctly. A lot of them have to be cold centrifuged. A lot of labs don't have that. And the samples are generally not handled in a way that's going to give you accurate information. So this is such a significant problem that the people who have to get insurance coverage for this will, and they're really dedicated to the testing and they understand the issues. I've heard of many practitioners who have their patients come in and they'll be there all day. They'll have them do a bunch of stuff to provoke a flare, and they'll test them every hour, just hoping to get an elevation so that they can say that, they can really give them this diagnosis and get insurance coverage. That's a problem. And when I talk with my colleagues, what we're seeing is only about 10% of people have any elevations in the mediators that are being tested. That means we're missing 90%. The third part of that criteria is you have to have an improvement in symptoms with a antihistamine medication or a mast cell mediator. The problem with that one is that other than cromolyn sodium and compounded ketotifen, every antihistamine or mast cell mediator medication available in the US has inactive ingredients that are mast cell triggering. So somebody may respond to the medication, but then have worsened symptoms or no improvement because they're reacting to the dye or the titanium dioxide, the cornstarch, whatever else is in there. So you can see that this has a lot of room to continue to evolve. And I hope it does keep evolving, and I think it will. But this is where we're starting. It's got to start somewhere.
So what would the treatment be then?
Well, there's no single treatment. And I should probably say that I don't diagnose myself. I do consulting, and I don't treat, diagnose or prescribe, but I do a lot of consulting for people. The real way of addressing this is to figure out what's going on that's causing it. And you want to look at there's a ton of stuff you can look into, of course. People talk about parasites and talk about heavy metals and getting your gut back in balance. And after having done this kind of work for about 10 years, I've been in this kind of consulting area. I can tell you there are three major things that affect the vast majority of people dealing with this. One is nervous system dysregulation. And that's why I talked about the mast cells being at every nerve ending. There's a constant communication between the nervous system and the mast cells. So it's really fascinating. The mast cells actually have receptors for neurotransmitters, and then the nerve endings have receptors for mast cell mediators. And so the nerves are saying, oh, we're in danger or we're safe. And the mast cells are responding based on what the nerves are telling them. And then if the mast cells are getting triggered, they're going to trigger the nervous system. So a lot of people deal with nervous system symptoms like can be anxiety, can be feeling wired, just chronically exhausted, brain fog, depression, sleep issues. This is important because, one, we live in a traumatized society. And even people who think they don't have any trauma, I ask, I dig in, and there's something somewhere for a lot of people. And we live in a really high stress culture. So if you look at, for example, if we just compare, one of the cultures that I've studied they're often called the Tarahumara or the Raramuri is what they call themselves. They're a culture in Mexico, and they still live their traditional lifestyle in the mountains. And they don't have bills or money or any of these kinds of things. They don't have television. They grow the food they need to eat. They take care of each other. They share. And then they spend a lot of time resting. They also spend a lot of time exercising. They're famous for being runners, long distance runners. And we don't live like that. We go. And if we think about how we just came off the holidays, and traditionally the winter is a time for deep rest and deep relaxation, but our culture doesn't really allow for that unless we fight to carve it out for ourselves. So I say all of that to say that I have yet in over 600 people met anybody who didn't have a dysregulated nervous system who had chronic illness. I'm not saying nobody doesn't. There are people who don't, but who have chronic illness. So that nervous system side, I have learned, is at least 50% of the healing process. And that's things like balancing what we call the limbic system in the brain that monitors safety, and the vagal nerve, which is a whole complex. This is really critical. And has a role in chronic hives. So there's studies that look at the role of itching is this interface of the nervous system and the mast cells is what's going on there. So if we want to calm it down, we actually need to work on both angles. And that's why just the antihistamines weren't getting rid of the hives alone for me. I had to combine that and had to really settle my system down. And I was kicked in the head by a horse when I was a kid, and that was a major brain injury. And I had these car accidents and different things that were very jangling for my nervous system. So that's one big one is the nervous system. And that's a great place for people to start, because you can start incorporating 15, 20 minutes a day. If there's a great Buddhist saying that I love that says, everybody should meditate 20 minutes a day unless you don't have time. And then you should meditate for an hour. And it's because it's an illusion that we don't have time. I mean, I have people who are CEOs and have 6 kids, and they figure out how to carve the time out for themselves. And it's a game changer. And I have a course on that if people aren't sure where to start. And then the other 2 big ones are mold toxicity and Lyme. And I think the reason that we have such a Lyme epidemic is because of the mold epidemic. Mold dysregulates our immune system so much we can't fight off bacteria and viruses like we should. I think it's a big issue with this just rise of viral issues we've had the last couple of years. But the mold is a bigger issue than it was when I was growing up 40 years ago. So I had a, bad luck of the draw in an old, over 100-year-old farmhouse. Most people don't grow up with that kind of exposure. But what's changed is the amount of chemicals we're exposed to. That's kept ramping up. We build houses tighter, so there's less airflow, it traps more humidity. And then I've spoken with people who are some of the top mold inspectors in the country and asked, what is going on? I know it just in my period of time, I'm seeing this escalating. And I talked to my colleagues who've been working for 40 years. They're seeing it escalating. And they've told me the other big factor has been the Wi-Fi that we brought in, the EMFs that we brought into our homes. They're seeing mold growing faster and producing more mold toxins. But we're not going to get away from EMFs. So we have to start shifting our lives to deal with that. But we bought a house 2 years ago, and we took over 6 months of looking to find one house that didn't have a major mold issue. And we still had to do some remediation. We looked at over 50 houses. Wow. And the only places I've seen people not have mold in their homes who have chronic illness, I'm not saying every house does, but people who have chronic illness that I've worked with, only places I've seen mold not be there has been Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, away from the lake, those really desert areas. And mold is just the biggest root trigger. When people can get rid of mold, their bodies recover. They can usually, about 30-40% of people will recover from Lyme on their own. That was my case. I never treated it. And then the other percentage of people can tolerate the treatments at that point, and they can finally kick it. It's the same for SIBO, for parasites. So that's why I don't put those as the primary root triggers, because if you've got mold, you can't get the gut back in balance. You can't get the hormones back in balance. You can't fix sleep. Mold just keeps dysregulating all of it.
That's really interesting point, because I know a lot of us do see functional medicine doctors. A lot of times, we're working on gut, eating those ferments, as you mentioned, and like I have high estrogen and gut issues and this and that I've been working on, for a long time, and it's like it never gets better. So. Right. When I took that mold test, I was just like, wow, like this could be causing all of these things that I've been trying to work on and haven't been able to fix.
Yeah, mold disrupts I've got just piles and piles of research on this. It disrupts the hormone balance, disrupts the nervous system signaling. It disrupts the whole GI tract because it's part of our detox. Mold is dumping into the gut. Those mold toxins, they've used mold toxins, specific ones for chemical warfare. I mean, we have to realize how toxic these really are. And then mycophenolic is it's used in chemotherapy. It's one of the most toxic of the chemotherapies. So, and we think about chemotherapy, the real goal is to try to kill the cancer off before it kills you off. That's how toxic it is. One of the things to tie this back in with the skin is, so these mold toxins, they can come in through our skin. We can absorb them through the skin, we breathe them in. They can land on our food, get in our drink if we're in a moldy environment. So you can have mycotoxin toxicity. Then another layer of that is if you actually ingest the spores where they've landed on food, they've landed on drinks, you're breathing the spores in. People don't usually get fungal infections in their lungs, but the gut is really common, and the sinuses where you breathe it into the sinus is really common. Then it's growing inside of you, just like bacteria can grow inside of you, viruses can grow inside of you. And about 70% of adults with mold toxicity are colonized. They have it growing in them. When it grows in us, it's producing more toxins as it's growing. So even if you get to a clean environment, you got to kill that mold off in your body to stop this increasing levels of mold toxins in the body. And the skin is our largest by size detox organ. So we think about detoxing with the liver, and then it gets dumped into the urine and into our bowel movements. We pass it that way. But we also pass toxins through the skin. And I've had clients of mine who came in and their skin was peeling off in sheets from both the amount of toxins, and then they had actually gotten colonization on their skin because their skin had just started to break down so much. So that's a game changer. If you get rid of these toxins getting excreted through the skin and you stop these spores from continuing to produce these toxins, that I don't have any itching anymore. I don't have any hives. I don't remember the last time I've had hives. Actually, I do. I had been gluten-free for a very long time. It was my husband's birthday, and we were scuba diving, and the boat we were on, they had made a banana cake for him, and I really wanted to try it. And it had wheat, and I ate it, and I broke out in hives and eczema on my arms. So that was okay, I'm done with wheat probably forever for me. But I don't deal with any of those things anymore with getting this stuff handled out of my body. It's a game changer. I will say though, that the final goal is ideally for people to be able to come off of those antihistamines or mast cell meds. But if people are doing mold detox, I just really want to encourage people to stay with what's stabilizing their mast cells, because I've had so many people who they started feeling better, and then on their own, they made a decision that they were going to stop taking that stuff, and they flared just massively. It set them way back. So you want to stay on what's keeping you stable until you get that mold out of your body and you're on the other side of it.
Right. Okay. So what would that look like then, the whole mold detox? What does that entail?
Yeah, it's a process. So first you want to know which mold toxins you're dealing with. My preference is different ways of testing. My preference is to use the urine tests, and real time is the first one that I use. And then if somebody has the budget for it, I also use Great Plains. They have really good tests. There's one by Vibrant that is going through some evolution. I haven't seen consistency with it and the other tests, so I haven't used it right now, but some people do like to use that one. There are ways of testing for antibodies, and that's a whole different system of looking at it. I haven't found it as helpful in terms of guiding an approach, but it'll show you if you're having immune reactions to those. Never clear if that means present or past. So all that to say, you've got these different testing options. I found the urine to be the easiest to follow and to work with and to guide what to do. Then I was on research team with Dr. Neil Nathan, who's a wonderful person to put on everybody's radar if you're not familiar with him. And he's my mentor and a friend of mine, and worked with him, Emily Givler and Joe Mather, and a group of us really combed the research. I mean, we're talking weekends and weekends of going through all of these papers to map out which binders bind best, which mycotoxins, based on what we know right now. And that'll keep changing, but what we know right now. And what we found is that they don't bind equally. So when we're talking about binders, we're talking about things like activated charcoal, bentonite clay, chlorella. There's a type of fiber called propylmanin that can be used. And there's prescription binders like Welchol and cholestyramine. So, and Saccharomyces boulardii, that's a beneficial yeast, also will bind aflatoxin, gliotoxin, zearalenone, but it doesn't bind, for example, ochratoxin as far as we know. So we want to have that testing so that we can see which of the binders are going to work for which molds this person has. And then these chemical structures for these mold toxins are very complex. So if anybody's taking chemistry and you remember seeing a molecular structure, they actually have lots of facets and sides. So you want to use as many different binders as you can tolerate to most effectively bound up that toxin to help your body move it out. If somebody only has mold toxins, that may be all they need, and maybe a little bit of detox support. So another big thing that we worked on with these research projects was Emily Givler and I mapped out which detox pathways in the liver work for which mold toxins. And that was huge because we were looking a lot at glutathione, but it's not used very much for molds. There's a pathway called glucuronidation that almost never talked about, but that gets supported with things like calcium deglucarate and dandelion, pterostilbene, which comes from type of wild blueberry. These kinds of things support that pathway. Rosemary supports that pathway. And most mold toxins need that to get processed in the liver, not glutathione. So then that may be enough if that's all somebody has, and they had short exposure and they weren't that sick. But for those of us that had a lot of exposure, we have the colonization, then we have to go on and do an antimicrobial phase. And that can include herbals. And then most people end up having to work up to some kind of prescription antifungal.
Okay, so that sounds really complex. So probably something that you need guidance on.
You want to be guided. It's really helpful to work with somebody who knows this area, who can help support. But I did put also a course together on this because it is so complex. And so I put the course together, it just steps people through the very beginning, the testing, how do you get your testing back, how do you look at it, how do you pick your binders, how do you pick your phase 2 supports, and then in the advanced level, I go into the prescription antifungal options. How do you stabilize your mast cells while you're doing all that? So it gives people the whole roadmap. It may not get them 100% of the info they need because some of it is case by case, but at least gives the really solid foundation where people can get going on that, because you can't put it together on your own. I spent 3 years solid putting that course together.
Wow. Yeah, it's really comprehensive. I did take that course and I
good.
learned a lot. I was blown away. And I'm not real sciencey, it interests me because, obviously like it affects me. But, maybe it's the brain fog. I have a really hard time kind of, picking out those, more technical things. So I really liked how you explained everything. It was very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's why I made the workbook so people can just put down for themselves what their step is, what they need to do. I remember what it was like to be brain fogged and I couldn't read a book.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
Yeah.
So what about, can we talk I know we've only got a few minutes, just real quick about diet, because I see a lot of people who, we're all different and we all react to different things, but they'll follow these lists, and then they get confused because there's so many different lists. Some people, they pare themselves down until they're down to, chicken and rice. And it's,
Mhm.
I'm not, I'm not a doctor or nutritionist, but I feel like they're kind of doing themselves a disservice. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard road. So I was in the same boat, made the same mistakes, and I got down to about 10 foods if you didn't count salt, pepper, seasoning. Um, what was going on for me is that sometimes I would eat and I'd be fine. And sometimes I would eat something and the itching would explode. The sleep, my insomnia would be so much worse. My anxiety would be so much worse. I'd be running to the bathroom all day. So I started keeping a food diary, but here's the mistake that I made was instead of looking for big general patterns, I was looking for every single food that seemed to be a trigger, and then I would pull it out. And I think, and I've worked with a lot of people who were down to 2 foods, 5 foods. And that's the consistent theme is what we're doing is we're getting too far into the weeds. And what I learned from that is that one, mast cell activation, people can just react by eating. And it doesn't matter what you're eating. It could be chicken and rice today. It could be pork and quinoa tomorrow. The key with the food journaling is to look for the bigger patterns. And some of the biggest ones for people, and the ones that I look at the most are histamines, lectins. Lectins are a protein in some foods like quinoa and other grains, corn, wheat, and they're going to be in things like tomatoes, eggplant, squashes, all that. And then salicylates can impact people. It's more common in mold toxicity. Oxalates. Oxalates can trigger the skin. Salicylates can trigger itching. And FODMAPs can trigger gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation. So you look at the symptom profile, and then I encourage people not to try to reduce all of that at once because you can get into this downward spiral. And I tell you, the most dangerous one for people to pull out are the sulfur foods. If people do have to go low sulfur, like for gut issues, need to be taking Epsom salt baths if they can all tolerate them. Even if you can only do a teaspoon, got to get some sulfur back in because we can't live without sulfur. And it's gotten this bad rap online, but our mast cells use sulfur to stabilize themselves. They make something called heparin sulfate. That's the primary stabilizing mechanism. Plus, we use it for detox. We use it to process oxalates. People usually feel better for a few months, and then they're in big trouble. So what generally, if I'm just thinking about somebody who's dealing with itching, they're dealing with hives, and maybe have a few other symptoms, I'm probably going to suggest trying low histamine and just seeing where that gets you for 6 weeks. And then if there's autoimmune issues, if there's any cancer history, joint pain, burning, cardiovascular issues, then it might make sense to also try lower lectins and just see where that gets you. I do have some people who've had to be low in all of those. And the key is to find as much variety as you possibly can eat and to eat as many different herbs. So even as somebody who has to eat low salicylate, cilantro, if they don't have that soap gene, they can eat cilantro. Herbs are some of our highest antioxidant foods. So they can have cilantro, they can have chives, onions if they can do onions. And one of my mottos is to not keep whittling down, but to replace. So think about if I've got to pull out strawberries, I'm going to, because they're high histamine, I'm going to put in blueberries and raspberries. The other thing I want to say on the foods is that it is a wild west of food lists out there. And there are, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of mistakes. And I see histamine lists that allow walnuts, but walnuts are high histamine. Not all nuts are high histamine, walnuts are. Or I see lists that say, well, these foods contain histamine, but then they allow fresh fish from the grocery. But fresh fish is one of the highest histamine foods. So because the guts are still in the fish and you get this bacteria buildup. Or they might allow histamine liberators like cinnamon. And having made a number of different types of foods lists, we have a 3-person review on these things. It's so hard. And we've had a couple mistakes slip in there that we had to fix, but you want to make sure you're using a really good list. So if you're doing histamine, Janice Jonaja is an expert in this area. Healing Histamine has really good lists. We have a really good reference list. Just make sure, I mean, I've even seen lists that allow like coconut aminos, but they're fermented. So it doesn't make sense. So you just got to watch, make sure you're getting good info as well. Otherwise, it's so confusing. You have no idea if you're really low histamine or not.
Yeah, it's definitely confusing. And I think a lot of people get overwhelmed. And I know for myself, I actually, for years, considered the low histamine diet, but I was so overwhelmed that I just kept putting it off because I felt it was too complex. Meanwhile, I'm drinking kombucha, you know? So I'm really glad that you shared that. And I usually share your list. I like your list. So you said like start with the low histamine diet for 6 weeks. So then are you reintroducing before you then cut out the next group of foods?
Yeah, it's a great question. Kind of depends. So when I'm working with somebody, I also evaluate their bandwidth and how much can they handle and how challenging is this for them. But the simplest way to do it is to try 6 weeks. Do a really good low histamine. We have lots of low histamine recipes. I'm a foodie, so I had to find all kinds of ways to have enjoyment doing this. And you can get a lot of variety. You just have to be a little more creative. But I've tried for 6 weeks, document what's happening, because it can be hard to remember when we have a lot of symptoms, what it was like 6 weeks ago versus now. See if you're getting any improvements, and then give yourself a day of eating fairly high histamine. So that might look like having some canned tuna or canned salmon, having some strawberries, some pineapple, kombucha, having some fermented sauerkraut, things like this. And then see what happens with your symptoms. If you get this big elevation symptoms, and it may be up to 3 days later, it can take people up to 3 days for that histamine that you ingested to get dumped into your bloodstream. And this is, just as an aside, part of the waking people have at 2 to 4 a.m. That's sometimes called the histamine dump, because that's when your histamines your body's been processing all day dumps into your bloodstream, or it's been storing all day dumps into your bloodstream to then get processed by your liver. So watch for that as well, like that 2 to 4 a.m. waking, or are you waking up all night long? Histamine regulates sleep as well. And then if that made a difference and you're doing better lower histamine, then you could stay just lower histamine and try layering in what is the next suspicious thing. So it might be lectins, for example. But I wouldn't try to do it all at once. It's hard. And the other thing I just really want to share with people is, if you're looking at oxalates, do not drop down oxalates cold turkey, because oxalates work very differently than these other things we're talking about. Oxalates are crystals that are in things like spinach, sweet potatoes, beets, are super high. And that was my joint pain, where I was using a cane to barely hobble. It was like walking on ground glass. It was awful. But those crystals, when you lower your oxalate foods, those crystals are going to come out of the tissues into the bloodstream, and you can trigger kidney stones if you go down too quickly. So you've got to take that down really gradually over at least 6 months, better like a year, and make sure you know what you're doing there. So don't stop oxalates cold turkey. That's dangerous.
Okay, it's really good to know. I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I thank you so much again for all the information that you provided in your blog. It's just so helpful. I'm always referencing your blog. I'm always looking at it. I'm always referring people to it. It's so comprehensive, and like I said, that's just so helpful. And I really appreciate you coming to talk to us, because I know that it's going to help a lot of people.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm so glad. And, for me, the most of my life up until about 5 years ago was honestly a nightmare. So if I can take what I went through and help people with it, and they can improve, and we can just get one more person not have to go through that alone, that makes it worth it. So I also want to thank you for letting us get this information out and everything that you do to help support people as well, because I know how hard this is.
Thank you so much.